San Juan Regional Medical Center is your community hospital, committed to making life better for the communities we are privileged to serve. In fact, better is our mission, improving lives through personalized health and care. What matters most to our patients matters most to us, offering a comprehensive range of inpatient, outpatient, and emergency care services so you can get the quality care you need right here at home. San Juan Regional Medical Center, celebrating life better here since 1910.
"11 minutes past 8 o'clock. It is Thursday morning, the first day of the month of September 2022. Good morning, everyone. I'm Scott Michlin. Thanks for tuning in to KSJE this morning. 90.9 FM over the air here in San Juan County, New Mexico. In Durango, Colorado, you can tune in at 103.3 FM. And if you're anywhere else on the planet, you can always listen to us from our website, streaming 24/7, 365 at ksje.com. We also welcome our viewers who are watching this visual radio program. KSJE is a community-supported visual radio station, so we welcome our viewers who are watching on the KSJE Facebook page, our YouTube channel, and our Twitter account. Welcome aboard, everyone. We're glad that you are with us this morning because coming up, my guest, archaeologist Paul Reed, will be joining me. Our topic this morning is archaeology and drought. Some really interesting things that have come back into view because of drought conditions all across the world. We'll be talking about some of these cases and more in the next few moments right here on KSJE, so stay tuned for that. Then next hour, of course, Mick Hess will be here roving with the arts. Mick is playing some more music this week from female composer Fanny Mendelssohn Hensel. You'll hear her music coming up at 9:06 on Roving with the Arts here on KSJE. Don't forget, of course, you can also connect with us on our Instagram page in addition to Facebook and YouTube and Twitter. And if you're a podcast person, we invite you to subscribe for free to KSJE Podcasts, wherever you listen to podcasts, and maybe discover a new program that you may have missed. Outside our studios here at San Juan College, it is a sunny Thursday morning, 66 degrees at the moment, humidity 53%. We're expecting a mostly sunny and hot day again today, 93 for a high this afternoon, 62 and clear overnight tonight. Tomorrow warmer yet with a high of 96 on Friday. 66 overnight, 91 on Saturday, sunshine 93 on Sunday, back up to 96 on Monday, and take a look next week, even near 90 degrees for all of next week as well. Things might cool off towards the end of next week, upper 80s to low 80s next Saturday, but it is still warm weather here in the region. Well, let me welcome my guest who is joining us once again from his home in the Taos area. Archaeologist Paul Reed is back on the program again for his regular visit. Paul, good morning.
Scott, good morning. So glad to be back on with you.
You bet. Good to see you, and thanks for being here. And as I mentioned, the topic this month, you and I kind of talked about this a little bit, but I think it's really fascinating because, unfortunately, because of drought conditions and maybe climate change in some parts of the world, some underground or underwater archaeological sites are coming back into view. And so I guess folks like in your line of work are getting another glimpse at some of these things, and the rest of us too.
Right. I mean, many of these sites were buried essentially under different projects, either big reservoir projects or with, in terms of some high elevation stuff, different parts of the world just being covered with snowfall and glaciers. So as climate change is unfortunately impacting our world and drought, tied to that, we're getting to see sort of some insights into places that haven't been visible for decades.
Right. One of them almost literally in our own backyard, right? And that is Lake Powell and Lake Mead, of course. Lake Mead probably more so. They are losing water because of drought conditions and water use here throughout the West. But there was a story that I found in the Deseret News a little bit about some of the photos of a very parched-looking Lake Mead.
Right. Both Powell and Mead are way down, with essentially they get filled through winter snows that, build up and then maintain in the mountains. And, the idea with this, of course, and the way that sort of the West has emerged over these decades and almost a century is that the snowpack builds up and then it slowly runs off and it fills our lakes, which has allowed a lot of population growth in areas. And now we're not getting the winter snows at the same levels, and we're not getting them late in the spring. And we're getting these early spring melts, so the water runs and really doesn't get into the reservoirs. So that's kind of the bad news. On the good front, for us as archaeologists and in some cases paleontologists looking for remains, is lake levels drop and we get insights into things. So, so it's kind of that good news, bad news. And for many cases, the managers in these places, think of Glen Canyon specifically with Lake Powell, they had no idea, even a few years ago or a decade ago, that they were going to be managing sites that were inundated, flooded, in the 50s and 60s when these reservoirs filled.
Right. And now they're coming back into view, right? And that's kind of what we're seeing. But because I guess they were filled more recently, there was some pretty good study of some of these sites that were lost when these lakes were filled.
Yeah, I mean, I think for the time we would say that. A lot of the laws that sort of govern what we do in the cultural resource world came about in the 60s after some of the biggest reservoirs like Mead and Powell, Navajo Lake in our own backyard began to fill. But what did happen, with the federal agencies at the time in the 50s is they realized as, dams were being built and rivers backed up, that there would be a lot of impacts to cultural resources and historic sites. So they instituted a couple of emergency sort of reservoir salvage type acts that went through the Congress and provided some funding. So, a lot of the work in Navajo Lake that was done in the 50s by the Museum of New Mexico, work at Lake Powell with the Museum of Northern Arizona, and a whole bunch of other projects through the West. With that work, we were able to get some insights into places. And now they're popping back up. So in Glen Canyon specifically, a couple of my colleagues, Kim Spur in particular, who works with the Museum of Northern Arizona, they're going back now and assessing archaeological sites in Glen Canyon, on Lake Powell, that now with a drop of, I think, up close to 100 feet in places, that these sites are coming back. So this is requiring a reassessment to sort of see what those sites look like and, what kind of management considerations come into play.
Right. And are there some things that you can do now with technology when the water is not covering these sites, maybe that maybe gives you a bit more information, a bit more data as to what we're looking at?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, certainly the folks working, back in the 50s and 60s put their best effort forth, but because those programs were set up as what we would call salvage archaeology, which fortunately we don't have to do a whole lot of these days, because with cultural resource management considerations, we do a lot more planning. And if there's going to be a big project, then the archaeologists can get in and help the planners assess how best to protect sites, and if sites need to be excavated, how to do that. In this case, they were working so rapidly, literally as the water levels rose, that they went through and did what they could. So I think this gives us a great opportunity to do in Glen Canyon and other places is to do really detailed mapping in particular. Mapping is a very non-invasive way to understand the archaeology of an area, and really with the work we do today, it's an essential first or second step to that. The other thing that we're doing a lot of these days is 3D scanning. So with these sites popping up, invisible, we can set up 3D scanners and go through a process of creating highly detailed 3D models, which are phenomenal. I've been involved in really just scratching the surface on a couple of these projects, one in Chaco and one we did at Salmon Pueblo a few years ago, and the results are phenomenal. I mean, we can draw these, we can take detailed photographs, but the 3D scanning gives us just some of the most incredible, data and models of these sites.
Very interesting. Very cool. One of the other articles that we were looking at, too, is from a park in Texas, right? And I wanted to share that with our audiences, too. This is from the Smithsonian Magazine and Dinosaur Valley State Park in Texas. Their river has dried up in spots, revealing dinosaur tracks in the, riverbed, which is now stone or rock.
Right. This is an amazing find. And of course, a little earlier than the stuff that we deal with in the archaeological world, but
right.
Our paleontological colleagues and the geologists are just thrilled with this. Again, it's balancing the concerns for drought and, our modern water needs with what's coming up in terms of the scientific opportunities. And we've talked about footprints before, Scott. We talked about, the pretty old footprints down at White Sands. What I think is really interesting now, this is probably, almost a dozen cases worldwide where folks have gone back in to look at places either through, drought revealing areas that were previously inundated or just other techniques. And now we're starting to see more and more tracks of animals and humans in different places. And, this gives us really good insight into what, these either ancient humans or animals were doing in the past, and really complements the data we get from other types of, archaeological or paleontological contexts. So yeah, pretty exciting stuff.
Indeed. And of course, obviously, it seems like there was evidence that dinosaurs were in this area before, since the park is named Dinosaur Valley State Park, but maybe not so definite to see the tracks in the creek bed or riverbed.
Right. And I think, again, this isn't what I deal with really on a daily basis, but I think that, the paleontologists used to feel that these were fairly rare occurrences to have, preserved tracks. And again, they're popping up more and more and more. So I think this is, again, just another super interesting level of information and data to help us understand, what happened in the very interesting past on our planet.
Sure. Well, and again, I would think too, you're right, because normally, right, if we walk in a riverbed, our tracks get washed away or eroded away or filled in or what have you. So the fact that these are preserved, just like the ones at White Sands that you mentioned too, I think there's just a unique meteorological or other types of geological situations that happen to preserve those tracks for thousands of years.
Right. It's remarkable. I mean, and this is true of, the whole fossilization process in general. There has to be the proper setting, a lot of times in real stagnant water, so that bacterial action doesn't remove, the flesh and ultimately the bones from animals or humans. And then over time, bone is replaced by stone, creating basically plaster casts, if you want to look at it that way. That's the fossilization process. In the case of tracks, yeah, pretty remarkable, because as you said, I don't know what, something like 99.9% probably of the tracks left on the planet by humans, animals, and plant remains as well, totally gone within a few weeks or a month. So the fact that we get these very interesting insights into the past, is remarkable. And this, of course, drives the interest that people like me have, the paleontologists, the geologists, other archaeologists, in piecing together, these different parts of our past.
Right. Very true. Another story I wanted to share as well, Paul Reed, is from Europe, and we've got a video clip of the article because I want to really show these pictures off to the audience. And so this is from the Daily Mail. Sunken village rises from the deep is the headline here. Roman settlement flooded to create reservoir visible in its entirety after drought causing water levels to drop in Spain. And so as we scroll through for our video audiences, at least they can see kind of the photos that are part of this. I think some drone footage that flew over this site, but pretty extensive foundations, it looks like to me, of some type of settlement, maybe a camp, a soldier settlement or something near a body of water. But obviously when it's flooded or when it's deeper, this area gets underwater. And so this is something that folks are looking at again, correct?
Right, exactly. And this duplicates the situations that we see in more natural settings. We've talked, I think, on a previous show about the bog bodies and the artifacts found in Ireland and Scotland, parts of England, other places in the world. Well, water, when you bury things in water, inundate them, you basically duplicate or come close to duplicating an anaerobic environment that we also see in deep cave deposits. So, it's kind of this interesting continuum with what's the moisture level, right? So there's sort of an optimal moisture level somewhere in the middle for bacterial action to totally destroy remains from the past. But if we keep it really dry, like a deep dry cave, or even big sites like we have, at Chaco and other places in the world, or we completely flood the remains and the sites and produce that anaerobic environment that way, we get incredible levels of preservation. And I think for a lot of folks, part of the astonishment with this is that these sites like this one in Spain are so well preserved, given the activity of the water and just flooding this site for decades. So I think that, what we are getting out of this among, in addition to understanding the remains and being thrilled with that, is we're better understanding how water does affect archaeological sites and paleontological sites in some cases, and really how we can deal with those. And I think that, again, the level of preservation deep underwater is something that has surprised a whole lot of folks.
Right, and just how large a site it seems to be as we take another look at this picture. It just looks like it covers a good section of that little outcropping there when it's not underwater. So it's pretty visible.
Right, and it's not like we're necessarily going to decide, hey, we want to preserve the site. Let's pump in millions of gallons of water.
Right.
But it again is just an interesting contrast because and I know in the case of sites close to our own backyard, the Glen Canyon example, and up in Navajo Lake, which at this point is not revealing a whole lot of new archaeological sites. I think there have been a couple of things. But to have sites still be intact and available for additional study and interpretation, it is a great opportunity. Clearly.
Right. Sure. And none of these are necessarily new, right? I think folks knew that the site was there just underwater. And so now that it's visible, it's just getting a lot more attention.
Right. If you want to look at it this way, essentially we've taken these sites and banked them.
Yeah,
in
right.
the future. And of course, no one would have anticipated that drought levels worldwide would have caused so many changes. And unfortunately, we are seeing that. But, sometimes you get lemons and you try to make the best lemonade possible, I guess.
Well, that's true. That's very true. And that takes us to another article, again, that I wanted to share about the same type of thing. This is again, from Smithsonian Magazine, hunger stones in Europe again. And these really fascinating to me, and I think to you too, rocks in this riverbed that maybe had been made dating back to the 1600s, the article says, to warn of impending hardships, because when the stones are visible, the level of the river is low, and that means drought, and that means crop problems and things along that line. And they've been dealing with this for a while, apparently, or at least back then.
Right. Yeah, I wouldn't say this is a totally unique case, but definitely a pretty rare case of people, etching and carving in the warnings into these stones so that when the water levels drop, people in the future, again, this is signaling from the past to the future,
right?
Saying, now is the time to worry, folks,
yeah,
because the water levels are down and we're not going to get water to our fields. So, let's pay attention to this. So this is an interesting sort of component, perhaps sort of hand in hand with an oral history, if there was one in the area, which I think would be a reasonable inference, whether or not folks have been able to do that research, that the stories would go through. But here we have a physical representation of, hey, pay attention when you get to this point in time. So, and in some ways, certainly a kind of a sad lament as well, right? That things got bad for us, and bad times come when the water levels drop, the rains dry up, crops die, famine ensues. And a lot of times, of course, in our past, in our human past, we have conflict when resources get scarce. So these things go together.
Right. And so these stones then, but they hadn't been visible for quite a while because water levels hadn't dropped as low as they have dropped now. And so I guess that's kind of the unique thing about it, that they're now visible again after a long period of being underwater.
Right. And again, I think this would be a super interesting project to pursue in terms of recording these, doing all the archaeology, and then, talking to local families in this area, depending upon patterns of population movement and displacement, and seeing if there are hints in either the oral history record or perhaps in the more written, the straight history record, to kind of connect these things back to the archaeology. For me, that's one of the most exciting parts of being an archaeologist, is looking at those components and then seeing how we can connect to these other lines of information, these other points of data, if you will, and then, just help us enrich the overall narrative.
Right. Very true. Paul, with all of your work, are you familiar with any type of similar system in the Southwest that would have maybe tried to warn others that we've learned about or discovered here because of weather and drought?
What we have is not a whole lot of what we would describe as written record.
Right.
In stone, I mean, we have a whole lot of iconography, different types of images that are either carved as petroglyphs or painted as pictographs, with indigenous folks across North America and in our region. But in terms of interpreting this symbol, this image definitely is this. There have been some real strides doing this, but what I would say is there probably are hints of things that have happened and have gone on that we perhaps haven't been able to fully decode yet. So I think that, with the work that folks are doing, particularly one of my colleagues down in Tucson, Dr. Aaron Wright, he's working with me on a project at Petroglyphs National Monument just outside Albuquerque that, I'll talk about on a future show.
Mm-hmm.
Very interesting work. Aaron has spent a lot of time working on the rock art, the imagery on stone of the Lower Gila area, in sort of extreme southwest Arizona. And what Aaron is doing with that is looking at the images and sort of understanding the range there, but then also connecting it to the indigenous peoples who are in the area today, and then some theories in rock art about how the images convey different points of information. So I think we're really on the verge of some breakthroughs there. So I'm optimistic about the ability to decode more and more of what we're seeing in different places, and then connect that to the oral histories of specific indigenous groups, and then connect to archaeological sites that, we have a lot of data on, and, at least some idea of how those come into play. So again, sort of enriching our overall understanding.
Sure. Well, and we certainly know that climate played a role in our area, the famous drought years, right? That didn't totally cause the abandonment of some of the settlements here, but maybe added to some of the unrest and dissatisfaction with folks. I mean, that's been part of the narrative for a while, and still fairly accurate, isn't it?
Right. It definitely is. What's interesting to me is that we've kind of pulled out the so-called Great Drought, which in the desert Southwest in our region is about 1272 to 1299. Certainly a long-lasting drought. If we look at the record through time, with sort of retrodicted values based on tree rings across a number of different areas and regions, we see that this drought was at its worst about one standard deviation, or about, with conditions about double.
Okay.
Let me back up.
Okay.
The science is complicated, but basically for that drought, the conditions were about double the worst times that we've seen in other times. The interesting thing to me is if we look at the 12th century, a period of time from roughly 1130 to about 1180, 1185, there was a much more severe drought where the level of precipitation was actually about a quarter of what it had been persistently in different times and places. So we got into a period of time there when I think groups were really struggling to keep their crops going and to have the water that they typically used for household use and for construction. The interesting thing about that drought, again, from 1180 or 1130 to about 1185, is we have the sites at Salmon and Aztec, the big sites in our region, continuing to be occupied. But what we don't see a lot of during that time is modifications to the buildings, and a whole lot of effort going into new construction. There was some that happened. And as we look regionally, we don't have a whole lot of sites that are dated with tree rings to fall into that about 60-year period of pretty severe drought. So, my sense of that and the way I've talked about it for the Middle San Juan in our region is that folks kind of hunkered down and they continued some of the things they were doing, but they definitely didn't prosper. They didn't build new places, and they may have had some times of famine and hunger because of the effects of that drought. Ultimately, what's really interesting to me, though, is as we get towards 1185, 1190, that's when the climate ameliorated, is the way we would say it. Rainfall continued or improved to levels that it had been at before. And actually, in the early 1200s, there was a period of 10, 15 years where conditions were probably better than they had been for several decades or even centuries. And at that point, we see a lot of growth in the ancient Pueblo world. So that by 1230, 1240 in our region, Middle San Juan, and up across Mesa Verde, we probably have more people on the landscape than we've ever had. So big bounce back from the 12th century drought, and then a boom of population in sort of the middle 13th century, again, 1225, 1230, 1240. and then going into what was ultimately a pretty significant depopulation of the area, and then the Great Drought coming in the 1270s. The interesting thing about that is that by the 1270s, we're beginning to see the signs of streams of people leaving, families leaving, lineages leaving, perhaps larger groups of villages beginning to migrate out to other areas, to Hopi to the west, to the Zuni Yakima areas south, and over to the Rio Grande, different groups of people. So that when the drought really took hold, it seems to me, looking at the record, that a lot of the folks had already committed to migrating, finding a new place to live. And so in that sense, the way I've talked about it, Scott, the drought, the Great Drought in the late 13th century, wasn't necessarily a cause of that movement, but it definitely was a factor as people made the decision, to move on.
Right.
It might have been the proverbial straw, on that camel's back.
True. But it sounds like what you're saying, Paul Reed, is that folks were already leaving before the drought really took hold, and that is from some of the research that you've been doing and been able to discover, right?
Right. And so that complicates our understanding, but we know that, humans in different contexts worldwide respond to climatic conditions, weather conditions, environmental conditions in different ways. So droughts don't automatically lead to people leaving an area, especially in the case of the Four Corners, where we've had, Pueblo people and Pueblo ancestors living in the area for 2,000 years or more. They were adapted to the area. They understood, the different cycles that were in there, and they had survived this more severe and longer drought, just a century before. So what we see in the record of the depopulation, I think, and this could be an entire show for sure, is some social changes, some upheaval, perhaps, in my view, maybe too many people on the landscape by the middle 1200s, and people beginning to think that they should seek their fortunes elsewhere. And then a little climatic change to maybe help drive that final decision ultimately.
Right. Sure. Interesting. Very good. My guest this morning, archaeologist Paul Reed, is here. He works with Archaeology Southwest at Salmon Ruins. We are talking about drought and archaeology and some of the impacts and some of the things we're seeing even today across much of the world. And so, Paul, I appreciate you being here. Of course, we just have a couple of minutes remaining, and wanted to touch on another article, another topic that we have discussed a few times over the course of our time together, and that is the Iceman. These really fascinating, again, another set of remains that have been discovered in the Alps, I believe, in Europe, correct? And there's a new story out, I think, from here's NBC News, that they've connected the Iceman to living relatives.
Right, really interesting study. This is Otzi the Iceman from 5,300 years ago, revealed by a melting glacier, some years ago in the Alps. And, they've done extensive studies on, how he was dressed, what he had eaten, a whole lot of really fascinating things. And this latest one is, connecting him via DNA to, I think, 19 different folks who are living today in Europe. So, again, it kind of circles back to just what we can really learn when we take the DNA, the genetic studies, pair them up with the archaeology, and really just have a much more rich understanding of the past. And, how cool to be one of this man's, 19, presumably there's more. Those are the ones they found in the study.
Right.
But how cool to be able to say, yes, I'm descended from Otzi the Iceman. Of course, as we go back in time through the generations, we know that people from the past left many, many, many descendants. So I would suspect that he has more than the 19 we've been able to detect. But, again, just a really interesting time bridge, if you will, from 5,000 years ago to the present, and connecting things. And I think helping to remind us that, we're all human, and we're kind of, even though our technology has changed, we're still sort of facing the same challenges and trying to solve the same problems ultimately.
Right. Very, very true. And I guess it's just because of the way his body was preserved after his death that they were able to get that information, I guess, that genetic information, to be able to do this and trace that, because we can't do that with every skeleton or remains that are discovered, correct?
No, we can't. But the interesting thing is, they've done this now for a number of human remains from the past. So we have a pretty good Neanderthal genome sequence from 50,000 years ago. So a lot of times you get enough genetic material that survives in teeth typically, and sometimes in harder bone as well. So for Mr. Otzi, he had multiple remains that, they were able to sample and help understand and connect his DNA to the present.
Gotcha. So maybe there'll be more relatives discovered from other folks in the future. Who knows, right?
Well, and I suspect, as people continue to do DNA testing, and, National Geographic is one, of course, that tries to connect people to different specific regions. Other areas where you can test, other companies will let you connect to the past. So I think this is probably going to pop up here in short order as, are you connected to Otzi? Here,
Right.
Send in your $125. And, we'll see if we can connect you to his haploid group from the past. So
Interesting. Well, that is free enterprise, I suppose, and that's America. But we'll see.
And I should say I have no interest in any of these companies, so this was not a shameless plug for one group or another, one outfit or a different one.
Understood. But that is some fascinating science for sure. So, Paul, we're out of time, but as always, thank you for joining me and talking about some of these fascinating things that are coming to light because of drought conditions around the world, and just interesting. We hope that the drought is short-lived and maybe conditions will improve, but we'll see. But that's where we are these days.
Right, indeed. Thank you, Scott. Pleasure as always.
Great. Thank you, Paul. Have a great rest of your month, and we'll talk to you again in October.
Sounds good.
All right.
Thanks.
That is Paul Reed from, of course, Salmon Ruins and Archaeology Southwest. He's with me every month, and we appreciate that. My guest this morning here on KSJE. KSJE and San Juan College present the Student Success Coaching Tip of the Week.
All right, again, for week tip number 2 from the Student Achievement Center is time management. We really encourage our students to develop a time management. This can include creating a study plan at the beginning of the semester based on your course syllabus. Ideally, you should study a little bit every day throughout the week. Even just 20 minutes can make a huge difference, so you don't wind up cramming and stressing out right before the big exam. Also, don't forget to look at the big picture. Review your syllabus each class and set the due dates on the calendar for exams, tests, and big assignments. This ensures that you have plenty of time for study for your tests or complete those larger assignments that are due.
The Student Success Coaching Tip of the Week, presented by KSJE and the Student Achievement Center at San Juan College. KSJE is supported by Aztec Motocross. Located on Highway 173, Aztec Motocross offers a safe and competitive racing environment for the growing off-road and outdoor industry. Upcoming racing weekends, September 24th and 25th, and October 22nd and 23rd. Also, the New Mexico State Championship Motocross Race Series, October 8th and 9th. Find out more online at aztecmotocross.com or 505-393-5222. The San Juan County Walk to End Alzheimer's. The walk is full of flowers, each carried by someone committed to ending this disease. When you take part, you're helping raise funds and awareness for a breakthrough in this fight. Join us in Aztec, September 24th at Minium Park for the San Juan County Walk to End Alzheimer's. Visit act.alz.org/Walk San Juan County or call 505-278-7927.
Some future industries could rely on